Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me here to give a talk here. I kind of came to a couple of talks in this event before when my colleague Buddhism, Robert Well, or Don Baker gave a talk, so it's a great pleasure for me to stand here and share my research with you. So the topic of my talk is Women and Buddhist Philosophy Engaged in Master Kim Iryåp. So here you see a picture of Kim Iryåp. So basically, I am a philosopher and a Buddhist scholar. So as a philosopher, in many cases, I deal with theorization, ideas. So I published several books on Buddhist philosophy and modernist Asian philosophy, and also did it in comparison with contemporary Western philosophy. So as I was working on, as I published a book on those ideas about Buddhism, I began to wonder how these ideas, philosophical ideas, Buddhist doctrines, actually have an influence on an individual's life. So to talk about, discuss Buddhist philosophy is one thing, and to see actually in what format these ideas is being practiced in an individual's life is another. So after I published several books, I began to look for a kind of concrete example to think about Buddhist philosophy in an individual's life. And as I did a research on modern Korean Buddhism, and especially women in modern Korean Buddhism, I kind of discovered this fascinating figure, Kim Iryåp. So, so this is also the Women and Buddhist Philosophy Engaged in Zen Master Kim Iryåp is also title of my most recent book, came out this March. A copy is out there if you want to see, look at it. So what I want to do today is just to share my ideas, actually the life of Kim Iryåp, and to think about what it means for a woman to practice Buddhism, and how these ideas of Buddhism, there are kind of very sophisticated Buddhist philosophy we can talk about, but how these ideas actually taking place in an individual's life. And that's what I want you to share with you tonight. And also in that context, I want to think about what it would be like for a woman to do philosophy. And I'm in the field of philosophy, but if you kind of know a little bit about the philosophy, philosophy is traditionally very much a male-dominated field. People say that, well, male do philosophy, but women, can you think? Right? So the philosophy has been a kind of the field dominated by male, and I'd like to think about what would it be like for women to do philosophy. There's something different between male philosophy and women's philosophy. And these are some of the issues that I'd like to share with you today. So, briefly, the women in world religions have been discussed starting from 1980s when female scholars began to be active in American academia. So in a kind of series of women in world religions, you see a kind of discussion about how women has been portrayed in world's major religions. For example, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and so on. However, women in Buddhist philosophy has not been kind of discussed seriously, and that is one of the fields that I'd like to explore together with the life and thought of Kim Iryåp. So, since it is related to women and Buddhism, I ask this question: how and why do women engage with the Buddhist philosophy? If women practice Buddhism, why? What motivates them to do that? Right? And women, Buddhism philosophy, how and where do they meet? To answer these questions, so I explore a life story and the philosophy of this figure whose name is Kim Iryåp. Now, before we get to that, I'd like to give you this certain kind of preamble about the situation or position of women in East Asia, and especially in Korea. As perhaps all of you know, that Korea has been influenced by Confucianism for a long time. So those is the just a couple of passages that was said in this major thinkers in Confucianism had an influence on East Asian women for over 1500 years. So here I give you two examples. So here is what Confucius, or Gongzi, or Gongja in Korean, has said about women. In the Analects book, which contains Confucius' teaching, no in Korean, in Analects, Confucius said only once about women, and this is a passage. Women and inferior men are most difficult to deal with. If you are familiar with them, they cease to be humble. If you keep a distance from them, they resent it, they complain. So in this passage, you see that Confucius put women at the same position with the most inferior men. Right? And then more critical statement came from Mengzi or Mencius or Mengja in Korean. So Mengja's teaching is recorded in a book called the Book of Mencius. And in this passage, Mencius says something which really became a standard of women's behavior in Korea and East Asia for generations to come, for 2,000 years. So look at the dates. Mencius Mengzi lived in the 3rd century before Common Era. But this passage is still relevant to Korean women in a way, even though we are all modernized and westernized. So here it goes, quote. At the marriage of a young woman, her mother instructs her. She accompanies the daughter to the door on her leaving and admonishes her, saying, "Go to your home. Always be respectful and careful. Never disobey your husband. Thus to regard obedience as the correct course of conduct is the way of women." So here you clearly see this statement, never disobey your husband. And that is the very womanly virtue that women have to, still perhaps have to follow in Confucian society and Confucian Korea. And in modern period, the situation changes a little bit. But eventually the idea is the same. Many of the people, many of the Koreans who grew up in Korea heard of this expression. The very ideal image of a woman is the wise mother and good wife. Basically, these statements tells us women's position is at home, and then women's virtue is to obey your husband. So in women's life, as you know, perhaps know, there are only three men: father, husband, and son. Women is father's daughter, husband's wife, and son's mother. So this has been a tradition for a long time in Korea. And in modern period, there were women who challenged this 2,000-year history of the Confucian tradition. And Kim Iryåp, about whom I'll talk today, is one of those women, the first generation Korean feminist who really radically challenged this Confucian tradition in Korea. So here I will give you a brief summary of Kim Iryåp's life. So interestingly, Kim Iryåp started her life as a very faithful Christian. Her father, Kim Iryåp was born in 1896 in northern part of Korea, nowadays North Korea. Her father was a Christian pastor, so definitely the first generation of a Korean Protestant pastor. And Kim Iryåp remember her father as the most faithful Christian in Korea. And influenced by her parents, Kim Iryåp grew up as a very faithful Christian, to the extent that she envisioned her future as a Christian missionary when she was only 7 or 8 years old. She said that I'll go to Africa when people do not know about God, and I will send God's message and save the people from the fire of the hell. This strong Christian faith of Kim Iryåp will gradually die out. And during her teenager years, she said she gradually lost her faith in Christianity. So since then, from her teenager year until until her about 60, until she reaches 60, she doesn't talk about Christianity. But later, she will reflect upon Christianity as a Buddhist nun. So I will get to that later. Not only Christianity was her religion or faith when she was a child, she also had a kind of really Christian education. The first public high school public female education in Korea was this Ewha and currently Ewha Women's University. So Kim Iryåp was one of those first generation of Korean women who received this newly introduced Western style public education all the way up to college. So in other words, she was very well educated, and then later, once she graduated from Ewha Women's University, or Ewha, she studied in Japan, and then when she came back in 1920, she was very actively engaged with women's movements in Korea as a new woman. And she created a journal called The New Women, which is considered as the first journal created by women for the promotion of women in Korea. And she also created a forum called Brutal Society. This is a kind of society in which Iryåp discussed the women's issue with other women in Korea. So that was 1920. So here you have I said that she was one of the frontier line new women. And new women is this newly educated group of women who claims the gender equality in Korea. So this new woman phenomenon obviously was not limited to Korea. It existed in the US and in Japan, in China, and Korea. But they are the first kind of a group of women who claims that gender equality as an important factor in their life and also trying to educate other women about the gender issue. And at the earlier stage of this New Women movement, a group of new women claimed about this kind of issue of women's sexuality. In other words, these women, including Kim Iryåp, thought that the Confucian society's emphasis on women's chastity is the way to control women and to suppress women. So they claimed, they demanded for free love and free divorce. So free love means that at that time, obviously, the kind of marriage was arranged marriage. In such a situation, they demanded that, the love affair is a kind of individual's freedom to express their personality. And also, if marriage doesn't work, individuals are free to get divorced. Remember, once again, this is 1920s Korea. It's not difficult to how people actually reacted to these women who claim for the free love and free divorce. But for the time being, they actually, these liberalist new women, they really very actively engaged with their ideas of gender equality and their goal for the freedom of individuals' love and divorce. So here you see that how when Kim Iryåp and other new women kind of claim for this sexual freedom, how serious they were. And in this passage tells us, right, so quote, "We new women and new men," so it's not just a new women, but new men, "who want to do away with all the conventions, traditions, concepts, and who are determined to bring attention to a new and fresh concept of life, cannot but strongly resist, among other things, the traditional morality on sex, which has ignored our personalities as well as our individual characteristics." So this Kim Iryåp and these new women, they really engage themselves in this kind of change of social morality about the women as a way to create a new, modern, civilized society. obviously. Before I go back to Kim Iryåp, I introduce another new woman whose name is Na Hae-seok. Some of you who know modern Korean painting might have heard of her name. Na Hae-seok was also a very well-known new woman and a good friend of Kim Iryåp. She was born 1896 and 1947, and she's known as the first Korean female painter in Western style painting. And Na Hae-seok and Kim Iryåp, they will really work together to promote these ideas of women's freedom through free love and free love affairs and free divorce and so on. So here you see a kind of Na Hae-seok was from very well-off family in Suwon, and she studied in Japan. She went to Japan in 1914, which obviously tells you that he was from very rich, wealthy family to go to Japan to study paintings as a woman in Korea. And then she also traveled to Europe with her husband to study paintings. So her husband was a very well-known diplomat. So here you see a kind of her portrait, self-portrait, which was painted in 1928, and some more kind of paintings. Suwon Castle, she's from Suwon, so Suwon Castle, and another painting is a dancer, and then the naked body. So here you perhaps see the very much kind of the French Impressionist kind of a strong touch. But later when she's in, she stayed in Buddhist temples some period, several years, and the paintings from that period is very different. But here I give you some kind of ideas how actively this first generation of Korean new women, they actually engage with their own lives as a writer or as a painter and claim for their freedom as a human being in a society, in Korean society, which was still very much patriarchal. Village by Na Hae-seok. So, Kim Iryåp was very actively publishing her literary works. She was also a writer. Literary works, short stories, or polemics about the gender issue. And she also kind of getting engaged with Na Hae-seok about various issues about women. For example, how to change traditional Korean women's costumes in a more modern way so that women can be more efficient in kind of social activities and so on and so forth. But starting from sometime late 1920s, Kim Iryåp began to slowly kind of slow down in her activities as a new woman and began to practice meditation. And she began to kind of go to different, she practiced meditation here. Here is a kind of a Zen center here in 1920s, very close by here where we are. And she studied meditation there. She also traveled to several different monasteries to study, practice meditation. And eventually, 1933, she joined a monastery and became a Buddhist nun. And from 1933 until 1971, when she died, she was a very active member of the Korean Buddhist nuns community. And she was also not only just a Buddhist nun staying at the monastery, she was a very well-known kind of celebrity in Korean society. So I kind of began to study or do the research on Kim Iryåp as a Buddhist scholar. But my parents' generation, they knew Kim Iryåp not as a Buddhist scholar, but as someone who is very well-known in Korean society. Not only as a kind of a new woman, as a writer, and as a kind of the Buddhist nun. And so that tells us that there's something that is very fascinating about Kim Iryåp's life and thought, which inspired many women and many Korean people in 1960s and 70s. So here, perhaps you have noticed in my very brief kind of summary of Kim Iryåp's life, that in Kim Iryåp's life, it looks like there are really distinctive two different phases, right? The first, before she joined the monastery, she was really very active feminist, who was engaged in the various social activities in Korean society, and who also claimed for sexual liberation. But then after she joined the monastery, she was a Zen master, Zen Buddhist nun. So scholarship on Kim Iryåp has claimed, scholars has claimed that Kim Iryåp's life has two different stages. Kim Iryåp was a feminist activist who claimed for sexual liberation, and Kim Iryåp was Zen master who lived a celibate life. And between these two lives, two phases of Kim Iryåp, there's a connection, there's a great rupture. And from the very beginning of my scholarship, I claim that that is not the case. Kim Iryåp is a new woman, Kim Iryåp is a Buddhist nun, but they were just a continuation of the same life of Kim Iryåp. And then I say that in both cases, the goal of Kim Iryåp was the same. She was looking for freedom, not just freedom and absolute freedom. So as a new woman, Kim Iryåp was searching for a freedom in a Confucian patriarchal society. And after she realized the limitations of such a kind of social system, she joined a monastery, and her search for freedom kind of got into more existential and ontological dimension. So here, some of you might be very familiar with the Buddhist worldview, but here I will briefly explain to you the Buddhist worldview to make a connection with the Kim Iryåp's Buddhism. The fundamental worldview of Buddhism tells you that the things in the world do not have independent and permanent essence. In other words, in our daily life, it's a kind of common that we look at things as a fragmentary individual. Here is a clicker, here is a speaker, here is an individual. But Buddhism says that, well, if you really look into how they exist, then you realize that things do not exist as just a kind of individual entity, but they always have a connection, right? So let me give another example. So it's around 8 o'clock, so did you have a dinner? No, you must be hungry then. So what did you eat? So I went to, I was treated with a very nice Korean temple dinner at Samso, 3 smiles, Samso. And we had sundubu, the Korean tofu soup, and rice, and kimchi, and we have a bean sprout, and there were some other vegetables. So I ate all this together. But I'm not tofu, I'm not kimchi, I'm not vegetable. On the other hand, it's also true that I ate all of them, and they are in me, and that's how I kind of get my nutrition. That's how I survived. So that's a Buddhist way of looking at things. On the surface, human beings and the vegetables and the spinach and tofu, they all exist separately. But if you really look into how they exist, you realize that they are really connected to each other. And there's not just 1 and 2 or 3 things that are connected to each other, but a lot of different things are connected to each other and then help you to exist, right? So at this point, how many of you think about oxygen? Do you ever think about oxygen? I don't. But without oxygen, we cannot breathe and we cannot survive, right? So oxygen is actually me, but I don't think I'm oxygen. So here comes the kind of 2 different ways of looking at things. On the surface, we say that human being and oxygen and space and a vegetable are all different. But if we really look at how they exist, we realize that our existence itself is possible because of various different factors which make contribution to my existence. That is what is called Buddhist worldview of dependent co-arising. And when you apply this idea to the individual self, we get to the Buddhist idea of no self. Buddhism claims that what you call self is actually no self. That is because I claim myself, Jin part, but then once again, Jin part becomes possible because of the food I'm eating, the oxygen I'm breathing, and so on and so forth. And there's no one permanent and independent essence called Jin part. So myself is actually no self. Now, obviously, there are various different ways of thinking about this Buddhist teaching. But at the bottom, what Buddhism wants to teach the people with this idea of no self is that just to look at how you exist and trying to open up your ego-centered world, because your ego does not exist independently, but your ego is possible because of all the other factors that make your existence possible. Now, Kim Iryåp used this idea to overcome the kind of gendered identity which the patriarchal society imposed on her. So as I mentioned before, as a kind of new woman, she tried to free herself from the self called women, which is imposed by her society. And after she practiced Buddhism, she called this the kind of self, gendered self, or the self which is closed by this certain kind of concept is small self or small I. And Kim Iryåp says that once we really ask ourselves how our self, this small self, exists, then we see that there are all these different factors which make this self possible. Once you realize that factor, you begin to open up yourself. And that opened self, the self which opened up, is called great self or big I. So here you said that for Kim Iryåp, then this Buddhist concept of no self or big I is Kim Iryåp's path to overcome the kind of gendered identity which she tried to free herself as a new woman before she joined the monastery. And there are several kind of interesting ways that Kim Iryåp described Buddhism and Buddhist practice, which we do not find in other Korean Buddhist thinkers. One such the concept is creativity, 창조성. Kim Iryåp says that the kind of, once you practice Buddhism and reach a certain state in your mental state, a spiritual level, the kind of state is called creativity. And if we really think about creativity, we use this expression a lot when we talk about artists, writers, right? And in a way, creativity is a mode of engaging life in a very open way, in a free way. If you are in a confined condition, not only just physically, but even mentally, if you are in a kind of confined and suppressed situation, you are not free and you cannot exercise your creativity. Only when you free yourself, you can exercise your creativity. And that is a quality that Kim Iryåp says that one attains once one practices Buddhism. Right? And another interesting expression is the culture. Kim Iryåp says that she joined the monastery in order to be a person of culture, Munhwa. And she says the Buddha is the greatest person of culture. And this is very kind of interesting way of defining Buddhist practice and the Buddha himself. But we can also make a connection between creativity and culture. What is culture? Culture is the kind of combination of human beings' creative activity. And in this case, both creativity and culture includes both the actually physical concrete reality, like the Buddhist temple, that is culture too, right? But the state of mind, which is free from constraints, that is culture too for Kim Iryåp. So Kim Iryåp thought that Buddhist practice leads human beings to the kind of point where human beings fully, ultimately exercise the freedom. And the external expression of that freedom is creativity and eventually culture. And once she in a way reached a certain point in a Buddhist practice, she began to rethink Christianity. I told you that at the very earlier stage, Kim Iryåp was faithful Christian, but eventually she lost her faith in Christianity. In her book, the 어느 수도인의 대상, Reflections of a Zen Buddhist Nun, which I translated into English, published in 1960, so by this time Kim Iryåp was in her 60s, she rethink about Christianity and reinterpret Christian doctrines from a Buddhist perspective. So Kim Iryåp says that the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, and not from Christianity, originate from the same seed. Okay? And it is in the sense that because God is not the object of one's worship, but rather a model or evidence of one's religious practice. And further, Kim Iryåp says that God is not the creator of the world, but God is the one who fully exercises the creativity. The creativity which Kim Iryåp says that everybody endowed with when they born into this world. And at the last stage of her life, in the books published in the 1960s, Kim Iryåp really goes at the bottom of our existence, which is life force, and or 생명 in Korean. And Kim Iryåp says that life is what is shared by all the beings. And in this case, when you think about life, we might think about only animated beings, like human beings or animals. But in Buddhist tradition, applying Buddhist tradition, Kim Iryåp applied this idea, life is the source of all the beings, both animated and inanimated. Right? What it means is that at bottom, the ground of existence is the same. And on surface, we are all different. But if we really look at the bottom of our existence, we will see the same ground of existence, which Kim Iryåp identified as life. So, here is a kind of questions that repeatedly appear when people talk about Kim Iryåp's life and thought Buddhism. This is about her relationship with women's movement. As I told you before, that before she joined the monastery, Kim Iryåp was at the forefront of a women's movement in Korea in 1920s. But after she joined the monastery in 1933, she never explicitly mentioned about women's movement. And perhaps because of that, people ask this question, did Kim Iryåp give up women's movement after she became a Buddhist nun? And many people do think that way and criticize Kim Iryåp for that reason, that you gave up the cause that you were so much dedicated to before you joined the monastery. But I have a different idea, and here is my kind of idea that why I don't think that Kim Iryåp gave up women's movement after she joined the monastery, even though she never explicitly talked about women's issue as a Buddhist nun. So in her 60s, so it's 1960s, Kim Iryåp published 3 books. 어느 수도인의 대상, which is translated as Reflections of Zen Buddhist Nun, essays by Zen Master Kim Iryåp, which I translated and published into English in 2014. And the second one is 청춘을 불사르고, Having Burned Away My Youth, 1962. And then the third one, 행복과 불행의 갈피에서, In Between Happiness and Misfortune, published in 1964. And Kim Iryåp died in 1971. If you read these books, it's kind of intriguing and a little bit confusing. What I mean by this is this. When I first read these books by Kim Iryåp, I was like thinking, what is happening here? Because in this book, Kim Iryåp talked about her life in very detail. And her life story, including her family members, and death of her family members. All her family members, her parents and her siblings died before she became 20. And including her intimate relationship, her love affairs with her ex-lovers. This happened before she joined the monastery, so it is not that Buddhist nun had a relationship. But it is her relationship before she joined the monastery. But still, when she published the book, she was a very well-known Zen master. And just imagine that you are reading a book published by a Zen master, and you are reading her love affair. And then he said, okay, what is going on? Why does she want to talk about her intimate relationship, right? And then gradually, you begin to see that, or I interpret it that way, that this is her way of engaging Buddhism and engaging with life, right? And the diverse topics that Kim Iryåp kind of presented in her books is all based on her daily life. And our daily life is, in a way, very much composed of very trivial issues, right? We got up in the morning and we have a coffee, we take a shower, we have a breakfast, we go to work, do the work, come home, have dinner, and go to sleep. Mostly this is our daily life. There might be something unique from time to time, but that is our daily life. Now the question is, how do we make meaning out of this? What is it that kind of put these things together, this kind of daily experience together, and help us to make meaning of our existence or values of any event? The way of doing it is that she put together her daily life and the life of her parents or life of her friends, and then she tells a story of their life. So here that I see the importance of a narrative, storytelling. We always tell a story. When we chat with our friends, we talk about what happened yesterday, what happened today, what happened while we have dinner, what happened on the train. Why do we do that? We rarely ask why we do that because we are so much kind of familiar to that kind of activities. It became our habit. But if we really think about why we kind of keep talking about our experiences, perhaps we might realize that this is our way of kind of trying to make meaning out of these seemingly trivial events of our life. By telling the story of our experience, we give a new structure to our experience and we create a new meaning to our event and experiences. And I think that that's what Kim Iryåp did in her kind of books, when she tells the life of the story of her life, and not only the story of her life, but stories of her friends, especially those female friends, those new women who actually claim for no gender equality, but eventually many of them had to suffer seriously because of their activities as a new woman. Obviously, because Korean society would not accept that kind of rebellion by women, right? But by telling the story, and I'm going to skip this autobiography stuff, by telling the story of your life and other people's life, your book becomes a kind of testimony of your existence. And I think that this is, in a way, that the women's way of doing philosophy. Right? The writing or narrative, and by writing and publishing their stories, you remember what happened in your life. Not only in your life, but the lives of your friends. Right? And by telling the story, that you become a witness of the existence of other people. So I say that at the beginning, I told you the kind of gender imbalance in the field of philosophy. People usually say that the philosophy is domain of men because the philosophy needs a logic and rationality. And women are emotional, they are chatty, so they cannot do philosophy. Here I kind of propose that there's a different way of doing philosophy, different way of finding meaning in our existence. That is not just a theorization or rational, logical interpretation of our life, but really being faithful to our lived experience and the remembered experience and give a meaning structure through narrative. Then you can do a kind of a philosophy of your own. And this is, I think, that how Kim Iryåp tried to do her philosophy as a woman and make a connection with the Buddhist practice. So very well-known feminist Buddhist, Rita Gross, who died 2 years ago, Rita Gross published a very well-known book called Buddhism After Patriarchy. So she wanted to re-understand, rewrite Buddhist history, not as a history of Buddhist monks and Buddhist male, but from women's perspective. And here she says, quote, both Buddhism and feminism begin with experience, stress experiential understanding, and move from experience to theory, which becomes the expression of experience. So this is a kind of idea that I put together women and Buddhism, right? The experiential dimension of Kim Iryåp's philosophy is an aspect shared by women in a patriarchal society and Buddhist philosophy in an academic philosophy dominated by the Western philosophical tradition. Second part, I don't have a time to kind of elaborate, but basically the idea is like this. Now in the West, we are in Korea, but in the West, Asian philosophy, including Buddhist philosophy, is began to be taught at the university level. But still, mainstream Western philosophy, many of them refuse to take Asian philosophy, including Buddhist philosophy, as philosophy. And one of the reasons for that is that Western philosophers say that Asians do not know how to think. Why? Because they do not know how to think logically and rationally. Because if you read the Buddhist texts, there are a lot of stories going on there. But then this is my response to such a kind of discrimination. So there is not one way of doing philosophy. There is not one way of finding the meaning of our existence and our life. There are multiple different ways of doing it. And if the West does it through logic and rationality, and if men do it through theorization, women can do it by telling the narrative, telling the story of life, their life, and being faithful to their lived experience. So in a way, this is a kind of conclusion part. Women and Buddhist philosophy. So when we put women and Buddhist philosophy together, we find a double minority position. Women is a minority position in a patriarchal society. Asian philosophy is in a minority position in a West-dominated society. Right? Gender discrimination combined with philosophical discrimination is a reality of women and Buddhist philosophy in both academic and personal sphere. Personal sphere, by this I meant that if you look at the monastic system, in terms of number, there are more Buddhist nuns in Korea than Buddhist monks. But if you look at this kind of a system of the order, you see that all the higher positions, by nature, default, were occupied by monks, not Buddhist nuns. So like in a patriarchal society outside the monastery, monastic system itself is very much gender biased as well. The marginalized position of women and Buddhist philosophy becomes a philosophical topic that reminds us of the power structure related to our mood of thinking. In other words, we tend to think that the values and the meanings are gender neutral, power neutral. There's certain kind of value everybody agreed to. But I don't think so. The values and the meanings of our life is very much influenced by the power of the time. Why do we speak in English? Perhaps because there are English-speaking people in this room, but in most cases, why people are so much crazy about learning English? Because America has a power, right? If Korea has a power, we'll speak Korean in the United States, right? And that is a kind of a power relationship, power dynamics, which has an influence on each and every kind of activities in our lives, which we, in many cases, are not, or we are ignorant, right? Oops, I think it's different. Okay. So by examining Kim Iryåp's life and philosophy as a paradigmatic example of women's philosophy in connection with Buddhism, we bring attention to the way women engage with Buddhism, how women actually utilize, in a way, Buddhist practice to go beyond the gender society, which I identified as a narrative philosophy and philosophy of life, instead of like a rational theorization. This approach opened the different ways to engage with philosophy and our meaning-giving acts, how we create a meaning and values in our life that are sensitive to the power structures involved both in our modes of thinking and being. They also explain how Buddhist philosophy is lived by an individual, women, in their lives, and how their lives enhance our understanding of Buddhist philosophy. Thank you. I will show you a couple of pictures here. This is Gyeongsang Heritage. It says heritage, but it's no longer a heritage. It is a second-story, very Western-style house where Kim Iryåp practiced. And inside the Gyeongsang Heritage, you will see this kind of meditation hall. And then here is the place where Kim Iryåp stayed, and here is a picture of Kim Iryåp, which we saw at the beginning, and Kyungwan S님, who is the disciple, second generation disciple of Kim Iryåp, who is actually here. There's a true kind of disciples of Kim Iryåp, Kyungwan S님, who actually got just last year received a PhD in Chinese literature at Korean University, and next to her is Nambo S님. Both of them are disciples of Kim Iryåp. And here is the Dharma Hall and the Sudoksa next to. And this is the kind of book party, book celebration when my translation of Kim Iryåp's book came out in 1914. This is the Dharma Hall, and here you see the Buddhist practitioners and the Buddhist monastics, and here are some Buddhist other scholars. They all gathered together. Civilian, the government began to open up a little bit. And only the time that the people began to rethink about this women, Kim Iryåp and Ahesa. So if you see that the books, publications in Korea dealing with the new women and the women in modern Korea, almost always you see Kim Iryåp's name in a various different kind of aspects. As a new woman, as someone who made a contribution to the change of women's costume in Korea, or as a Buddhism, and so on and so forth. So I would say that it still is very much, Kim Iryåp's life is very much relevant to Korean people now. It still needs to be, I hope that there will be more on that, especially from Buddhism side, because I dare say that because she's a Buddhist nun, not Buddhist monk, she's not too much studied in Korean Buddhism, and so we will try to promote her more. Yes.
I noticed a lot of parallels between Kim Iryåp's life and the life of Ham Seok-hun. Starting very early on, I don't have to recite it for you, but did these two individuals have interaction or influence on each other, or did they just have a lot of coincidental life experiences both here and Japan and back to here, and going into from a fundamentalist to the Mugyo to everything else?
Yeah, on the one hand, that as most people go to the United States nowadays to get their degree, right, doctoral degree. Most Korean intellectuals went to Japan during the colonial period to get advanced knowledge. So I believe that I think I read almost all of Kim Iryåp's publications that are available that I could find. And if I remember correctly, I don't see any mentioning of Ham Seok-hun in her writing. There might be somewhere that Kim Iryåp talk about Ham Seok-hun, but so far I haven't found any.
Okay.
So perhaps that's the one thing that we can look for. Or that also tells us the kind of the trajectory of Korean intellectuals in 20th century, right? How they move from realization of social issues and go to a kind of religious issue which offer more fundamental issues of human existence.